to week 2 of our course. And as always, we have a little bit of shop talk before the official recording starts. Today we are in week 2, and a couple things just in terms of housekeeping. For week 3, we have an esteemed budding scholar who's going to be presenting on, I believe, the return of Christ and millennial kingdom. And who is that scholar that's going to be presenting next week, Don? Who is that? Okay, Don's going to be presenting on that. Just in terms of a follow-up, I believe, Jacob, you asked a question last week about the new creation mandate or new creation model, I believe it was.
Yeah.
Yeah, by Block. I wasn't really familiar with the phraseology, new creation model. So I Googled that. I read a couple papers by Block. I read a couple reviews on a recent book he's published and so forth. And what I would say is that Block is not saying anything really different than what scholars have been saying maybe the last 15, 20 years, at least dispensational scholars. Basically, Block's premise, and he is correct, is that we are not heaven-bound people. Okay, we are not. Now, heaven's kind of an intermediary for us. Christ went to prepare a place for us, and when we die, our immaterial part of us, that part of us that makes us, right, that goes to be with Christ in the heavenly heavens, and we are in his presence there. But ultimately, uh, all vestiges of the curse will be eradicated and removed. And we looked at that last week. There will be no more death, no more sorrow, no more pain, no more darkness, no more serpent. Any vestige of the curse will be not just covered, but completely eradicated. And when that happens, which is after the earthly kingdom, okay, after that 1,000-year earthly kingdom, you in Revelation you see the new heavens and new earth, or the new Jerusalem rather. It descends to the earth, and the image there, men, is that God is moving home. Okay, God is moving home. God is moving back home in all his splendor and glory, and you're going to have a like Garden of Eden kind of experience, except it will be with all humanity, all regenerate humanity. We will all be in our glorified bodies. So there will be this kind of glorified community, glorified interaction. They'll be living life in a glorified way. Some people postulate there'll be the various cultures and nations and so forth. And we don't know just how far to go with that. But Locke's premise, and he's correct, we're not heavenly bound people. Ultimately, we are spatial. We have glorified bodies, and we will be on the restored, renewed, recreated earth. The New Jerusalem will be there, and God in his splendor, and we will be worshiping him throughout eternity. So now that's different than the older dispensational guys, like when Pentecost was writing, Thy Kingdom Come. And Pentecost was brilliant. And people poke fun at him. I don't really like poking fun at anyone. Um, uh, but Pentecost kind of argued, that the kingdom age, the millennial kingdom and kingdom age was more for the Jewish people, and the church was a heavenly people. We'd be up in the heavens, and as glorified saints, we could leave the heavenly heavens and come down to the earth and intermingle, and then go back up into the heavens. And Pentecost kind of saw that separation as a strong chasm. I don't think McLean did as much. But people have really moved away from that. So all that to say, Jacob, I'm glad you brought it up. The nomenclature I wasn't familiar with, but the concept, I am, and I've been there. So any general comments on that, guys?
I'm sorry, I don't have a comment about that. I'm having some internet trouble. Um, Going back to the presentation for next week,
Yes.
though, I apologize for just now getting back to this. But the list that I see shows Don in week 4, and
Oh,
I'm in week 3. I don't care which one is which, but I would really like to be prepared the proper week. Um, so
Yeah, I'm good if you go week 3 and I go week 4.
Oh.
I don't, like I said, I don't care. I just, what I'm
Okay, that's
looking at
fine.
is,
Good.
yeah,
Well, I'm glad. Yes, thank you.
is that correct? So I
So
have chapter 32
that's
next week
fine.
is what,
So
okay.
Josh is the esteemed scholar going next week.
Yeah, I thought when you said esteemed scholar, it must be me. So that's why I jumped in and said, sure.
Oh, man, he really is a budding academic, isn't he? Boy,
Okay,
you
all
got a
right. So
mutual
Josh,
admiration society
yeah,
here. All
yeah,
right.
Josh will be presenting that
All
next
right.
week. Let me just follow up a little bit on what Vlock is not doing and what he's not saying. Now, some of the more um, shallow pastors, I don't even want to call it preaching, but some of the more shallow communicating pastors trying to connect with people have argued that whatever is good in our culture today will be in the millennial kingdom and in the eternal state. So they look at what's good today and what God has approved today, and they argue that that must then be in the future eternal state. And sex really sells. It really does. So some have been arguing that, well, God approved sex within marriage. So in the future eternal state, you're going to be having sex with your spouse. Okay. And it's going to be glorified sex. So it's going to really be something special. Okay. So they've really spun some stuff on that um, in a more serious tone, probably starting back in the 90s. People were doing a lot of study on culture and preserving what's good in culture. And they were trying to argue that whatever cultural artifacts we have today and what the cultural movements that are good, we need to preserve because they're going to be in the future kingdom age. Um, we interviewed a really strange guy talking about that kind of stuff back at Cedarville University. He wanted a job, which myself and like 49% of the department said no. The other 51% said yes. Fortunately, he didn't take the position. Um, why does that not make sense, guys? Why does it not make sense to say, okay, we need to preserve what's good about our culture today because it's going to be in the eternal, the the kingdom age?
One thought that comes to mind is that what is deemed good about a society or culture, it seems to change all the time. I mean, you move in the previous generation, 50 years ago, 75 years ago, the outlook on culture and society and the world was different than it is now. And so I don't know how you would qualify that.
Well, yeah, he gave an example of art, Rembrandt, on art. We need to show appreciation for that and study it, and that needs to be part of the church and stuff because therefore we're gonna enjoy it in the eternal state. We need to do it now too. And I'm not an artist, to be honest with you. I mean, I've seen some of Rembrandt's stuff in museums. It's phenomenal. I look at it and I go, wow, that's really cool. That's neat. My daughter and wife look at it and cry. So it's like, that's the difference. Um, but it's
Well,
almost as if they're working backwards, you know, from things up into wanting to bring that with them. So
So
at,
if
at,
you
at,
was a,
at, at any rate, they what was driving that was this idea of a broadening Christianity, broadening our connection with non-believers, and appreciating cultural artifacts and trends and so forth and so on. And the way they justified it was through this idea of this new creation model, though it wasn't called that. That's not what Block is doing at all. So, okay. Anyway, I thought it was Jacob. Thank you for mentioning that, and I don't think he's saying anything different than what certainly I would be saying. He is I think a mild progressive dispensationalist,
Yeah,
but that that's a minor thing when it comes to all the broader issues of eschatology that he's dealing with.
makes sense. I appreciate your comments. I'm connecting the dots, so thank you.
Okay, very good. Okay. All right, guys. Well, let's go ahead then. Two things we want to do today. One, we want to look at Allison's book. I want to do that first, and then we have this whole thing on the Baptist movement. And there are reasons I write these case studies. Okay, and boy, there's a nuance in this case study that I want you guys to see. Um, I'm not sure you picked up on it. I've read all your stuff, but let me, let's go. Let's see. Let me go back. I want to pull up your comments on Allison here. And they were really good. I really appreciated what you guys wrote with respect to Allison. Allison used to teach 10, maybe 15 years at Western Seminary. Now, Western Seminary used to be Western Conservative Baptist Seminary with Rodmacher and company. I'm not so sure Rodmacher would have let him teach there, to be honest with you. But he's a good man, okay? And I have met him at Southern. I met him once and had a great chat with him. But let me do a screen share, and then we'll just kind of walk through the comments. Okay, are you guys seeing the screen? Okay. Well, why don't we just kind of go down the line, Josh? We're going to start with you, since you are our esteemed scholar for next week. Tell us a little bit about your assessment. You don't have to read it, but your assessment of Allison's discussion on Christ's return in the millennium.
Well, so I have, I'll be honest, I have a struggle occasionally because I've noted your comments, right? This is not a systematic theology, it's not a biblical theology, it's a historical theology. And then we want to deal with his, but then also we're dealing with his argument. And so, anyway, the argument doesn't seem to me to be the main point in a historical theology like that. So, I thought it was interesting, though. The main thing that I pulled out of it, of course, as a fairly conservative dispensationalist, was that he used some pretty inflammatory language for a dispensationalist. He didn't quite go that it was developed. What's the theory that there's some African mystic girl and that created dispensationalism? I forget all how that storyline goes. But next best thing that that Darby basically invented it. Premillennialism and dispensational premillennialism. And so, I mean, in order to do that, in order to make that kind of a broad stroke, he has an argument latent right in his description. Right. So, given the date that he wrote the book, is it 2011 that it was published? In the last, say, 14 years, there has been almost like a rebirth of the post-millennial unicorn.
Mm-hmm.
In certain circles, they've just started realizing, I think we see like, strong coming up with a congregationalist idea coinciding with the concept of representative government arising. People are influenced by their political situation. They say the United States kind of souring as an empire, and they start deciding they need to fix it. And so this post-millennial sentiment arises. But anyway, I did not discern other than that, that he was making an argument. And I actually find that to be appropriate given the way that he's composing the work, right? So I'm not sure. I mean, obviously, you don't want me to read it as fast as you're scrolling there.
No,
But,
no.
yeah.
Well, let
The
me
only
ask
thing
you
that I
this.
noted that would be really,
Do you think he was fair in his historical overview of the doctrines?
yes, and obviously I'm not as informed as he is on some of the details. On the only, how vitriolic Luther and Calvin were to the Chiliasts, and whether Origen really beat on this drum, given what's right here about universalism applying to every being, every created being. Was something that I hadn't heard before, but within my knowledge base of it, I felt that it was a fair representation of the position.
Okay, good. Okay, Don, I pasted yours in here. Just without repeating a lot from what Josh shared, what would be your assessment of his treatment, Don? Oh, you're muted.
Well, two things in particular. One is that I thought Allison in treating the doctrine of future things, going from the early church, moving through each phase like that. I think that he did a fair treatment dealing with the literature that he has. And so I thought he did a good job with that. One thing that I noted or should note is that beginning with Augustine, about that time period,
Mm-hmm.
Augustine's City of God, and its influence and his other writings, that affected the church's view of future things, present things, ecclesiology, etc., but especially the doctrine of future things. And so I just noted that. So the literature that you read is prefaced or prejudiced regarding the idea that the church inherits the promises, the promises of God in the Hebrew Bible, as well as they're the topic or subject of the covenants, etc. So you see all that. That's kind of this church. This is the Augustinian Calvinist hermeneutic bias is what I'm called it in our prior lesson. So I just see that. I sense that and say, if we start where he starts, then the church's assessment of, or his assessment of what the church believed down through the centuries is a fair treatment of that. The other thing is that, and we see it even today, is that current events, what's happening in the world where the church is living at any given time seems to influence, especially millennial views. In the early church going up to about Augustine, a little bit before then, you got the church under persecution. So you've got historic premillennialism that, recognized that there was some suffering that the church would have to go through, maybe similar to our view on tribulation passages. And then when you get to Augustine, there's a change there. The church is fat and happy. It's living in a world that is accepting it, and that it is having what it feels to be growing influence It is a change agent in society and in culture. It is hand in hand with the political systems as well as social. It's just kind of taking over or influencing to a large degree the worldview at that time. And so a church is fat and happy begins to say, well, maybe this millennial age is something that's going on now. And we're going to continue to gain influence and make the world, I guess, capture the world or influence the world for Christ, etc. And so that's one of the things I notice is that in each sphere, in each time period, the millennial views seem to be affected by, the historical situation, except that Augustine's influence on Calvin forward, even though the historical situations seem to change, the church could not and did not shake that early historical perspective or eschatological perspective carried from Augustine forward until you get to Darby. And Darby,
Okay.
he was out in the desert with that African woman, and it came to him. But he just actually, I think, to be honest, he actually just read the text. He read the scripture and said, "What does it say?"
Yeah.
Whereas scholars tend to read what the scholars say, and they use what the scholars say as their interpretive key to read the text with. So I thought Darby, did that. The other thing that I wanted to mention, let's see if I can jar my memory here. I'm going to go to my conclusion. Seemed like there was a point there. Yeah, I think the loss of in the church of a view of the eschatological purposes for national Israel, having, and again, I think the historical situation at the time of Augustine and forward, was the influence there. We just lost that. The church no longer considered, the text no longer considered national Israel as a key to understanding the biblical text and the covenants, etc. And so they read the scripture, from the perspective that the God is done with national Israel. The church has replaced Israel in the plan of God, and we should therefore adjust and adapt the text to come alongside that. So those are my initial thoughts.
Okay, good. A couple comments. First of all, John Darby gets a lot of bad press. If you ever read him, um, and if you look at the amount of information that he wrote and the amount of speaking that he did, he was a brilliant individual. And he just wanted to synthesize scripture from scripture. He did not want to work from a theological principle back and accumulate scripture. So he was kind of an expositor of scripture, and he just kept expositing books and like building blocks. He came up with what would eventually become a dispensational theology. Second, Augustine was brilliant. Okay, no doubt, brilliant. Guys of that era, Augustine, Chrysostom, they were brilliant, but they were just men. Augustine did not know Greek. He was a Latin scholar, but he did not know Greek, nor did he know Hebrew. So he could not work with the original text. That meant he was almost a slave to Aristotelian logic. So he was a logician. He was logic. Okay. So right away you know what you're going to come up with, right? If somebody can't work with the nuances of the text. Augustine, his work, his magnum opus, The City of God, is over a 400-page book where it's an apologetic defending the nature of the church against those who are blaming the church for the demise of Rome. That's what it is. I used to teach a Ph.D. course just on ecclesiology, and I had my students read. They had to read at least half of it, skim it. So there's going to be, and I think about it now. So you got a guy, right? He's trying to defend the nature of the church against the demise of Rome and the barbarian incursions. Who is not he's not really a Bible scholar, so it makes sense. It makes sense what you get. Um, and when I like to have fun with my Reformed friends who like to champion Augustine, I love to just throw them off. Augustine, guys, prior to his conversion, he was a very, very promiscuous man. He could never control his passions. Matter of fact, he had a live-in mistress. He had a child, and his mother was a dear Christian. And Augustine loved rhetorical theory. So one day he was going to go and he went to listen to the golden, I think they referred to him as the golden tongue, Chrysostom preach. And his mother was praying for him, and he became a believer. That's how Augustine became a believer. And he came back, he began to formulate his theology, but he could never get beyond his promiscuity. He could never get beyond the guilt of that. So he developed a very, very unbiblical view of sex. And he even hypothesized that the original sin of Adam and Eve wasn't that they ate an apple or a piece of fruit, but that they enjoyed their sexual physical relationship. And Augustine taught that sex really was just to procreate babies, and that it wasn't really meant to be enjoyed, and that there wasn't really a lot of difference between sex in marriage and sex outside of marriage, except sex in marriage would create babies. And then that went into the Middle Ages. So again, when my Reformed friends loves to, when they love to champion Augustine, I like to bring that up. And there's a group in church history that took Augustine and took that view and put it to bed. What group is it, guys? Do you know? And by the way, I would love to present this in a secular university. You know what group it was? It was the Puritans, because they were biblicist. Now, normally you don't think of Puritans as being pro-sex, right? Because of the way they're portrayed. But you can read, and I've read it some, you can read some of the love letters written from husband to wife, some of the Puritans, and they could write. Let me tell you, those people could write. And they are steamy. I mean, they are really steamy letters, as they describe their physical love life in Song of Solomon terms. So Augustine had, like anyone, some shortfalls. So Don, I appreciated your comments about that. Another side note, guys, is that Martin Luther, was an Augustinian monk. Okay, that meant his order, they specialized in Augustinian theology. So after Martin Luther rediscovers the truth, justification by faith, and the Reformation is really starting to, take off, he goes back to his Augustinian order, and he leads almost all of them to faith, because he shows them what Augustine taught and how the Catholic Church drifted from Augustine's viewpoints in the Middle Ages. So, Augustine, good. Okay, Jacob, how about you? Any thoughts here?
Yeah, on the one, I felt that Allison was fairly balanced in his treatment of dispensationalism. He, reading between the lines, he seems to be favorable to premillennialism, and arguably that's par for the course among conservative Southern Baptists. That, even Al Mohler in the big interview last summer kind of made that point, that while he was poking fun at dispensationalism, he affirmed he was a historic premillennialist, and Allison seems to be in that. What I would note, my two criticisms on him that I think are culpable at this point, is one, he doesn't even touch the possibility of a future for Israel. And back to the 15 years component, isn't it something that has emerged in the last decade that, like, even the Puritans, there was a stream of belief for a future for ethnic Israel that was
absolutely
developed. That was definitely ignored by him at this point, and it needs supplement. The other thing that concerned me, and this was not even in the chapter on the millennium, but on individual eschatology, is it was clear an assumed single final judgment for both the lost and the saved, and that is something that I would have preferred that he would have discussed some of the nuances within dispensational premillennialism that sees different judgments at play. Mm-hmm. The sheep and goats at the end of the tribulation, and the great white throne judgment, those kind of things. On dispensationalism, I think it was interesting also that he included Gladstone as one of the early progenitors. That's not a name I'm really familiar, and he even cites a list of dispensations from Gladstone along with Schofield. And there may be ramping up a bit of conversation right now amongst us about how important is the concept of a dispensation for our system. James Fazio is making an argument in the newer book that the term dispensation has more of an importance for the system, and that Ryrie sine qua non is not. So it was just interesting to see this outsider pointing out that. So on the whole, I felt that this was a decent section. I have more interest in development about the new heaven and the new earth, and frankly, that kind of ties in with even what you reported back about the new creation model. I think dispensationalists could do some, maybe at least I need to, maybe it's already been done, about Isaiah 65 and 66, where the new heaven and the new earth are prophesied, because those texts seem to have an intermixing of both millennial prophecy as well as the new heaven and the new earth and the final judgment. And again, he just very focused on some relevant controversies and metaphysical questions about the nature of the new heaven and the new earth. Will it be renewed, or will it be utterly new creation? So it was not bad, but I was left thinking there's a little bit of a foundational question on that. But I was relatively satisfied with his treatment of these subjects, and especially on the subject of the doctrine of hell and whatnot. That was a solid introduction to some of the real big issues. And to my shame, as a Baptist, they had to call out a Baptist who was a bit of a compromiser on that in the early days of the 1600s. I can't remember the guy's name, but I'll close with that. So,
okay, a couple comments. First off, I agree with you that traditional dispensationalists should start doing more work with Isaiah 65, 66, and so forth and so on. But the groundwork has been laid years back that we ought not to even use the term millennial kingdom when we're interacting with Old Testament texts. because there's no Old Testament text that says the kingdom age is 1,000 years. That doesn't come till Revelation 20. It's far better to just talk about the earthly kingdom age, okay? Or just the kingdom age. Just do it that way, okay? There is a coming future kingdom age, and an aspect of that future kingdom age has an earthly component, okay? And an aspect has an eternal component. That's Isaiah 65 and 66, okay? And just like the prophets, many times they're kaleidoscopic. Okay, by that it's like a kaleidoscope. They're jumping around from one topic to another, and they're also telescopic. So rarely do the prophets give you a complete single picture without jumping into something else when it comes to eschatology. Now, Blazing and Bach, they really made a big deal out of Isaiah 65 and 66 to promote their progressive model of dispensationalism. But it's far better um, to view when we're just doing a full systematic model. It's far better to view what we call the millennial kingdom, the kingdom, the earthly kingdom age of 1,000 years. Uh, Starts off. It kicks off the kingdom age. It inaugurates the kingdom age, okay? And then the full kingdom age comes into full fruition in what we would call the eternal state. So, kind of in that way, we're inaugurated eschatologists. We just believe that the inauguration occurs in what we would call millennial kingdom. Um, and dispensational scholars have been there, what I've just said, probably since the 70s. Now, before that, they made a mistake. Well, I think probably Walbert made a mistake, and guys before him, where they made a hard, fast rule. Okay, you've got the millennial kingdom, that's a separate dispensation. Boom, there's a cement wall. And then you've got the eternal state. And guys, I was on my way of rejecting traditional dispensationalism because of that. I couldn't get around it. And finally I started talking to a guy that was really good, and he goes, oh, no, we don't, this is where the current views are. So that's the first point. Second, I lost the train on my thought on the only thing I wish that Allison would have done is to also talk about how historic premillennialism was not developed in the early church as it is today. In other words, historic premillennialism today as a system did not exist in the first 300 years of the church. Now, there were components of it that existed, just like traditional dispensationalism or just dispensationalism in general did not exist as a theological system in the first 300 years of the church. It just didn't. It wasn't. Now, there were components of the system. It's just that nobody had put it together as a system, and that's because they had bigger fish to fry, right? They were wrestling with the hypostatic union, with modalism. They were wrestling with Arianism, these key issues that took a lot of their time. And not every church father had access to all the manuscripts early on. So it would have been difficult for them to develop a full system of eschatology. And I find unjust criticism towards dispensationalism as a system when individuals say, oh, well, it's a Johnny come lately system. It started with Darby in the 1800s. It's just reactionary. It's Johnny come lately. It's not valid. And I like to push back and say, well, you're reformed. Okay, you started with Calvin. Yeah, it's only like 300 years before. I mean, your system's Johnny come lately too then. Um, so in the early church, and it's been a while, guys, since I like before I've done like a deep dive into all the literature, but you find components of historic premillennialism. Okay, you find components of amillennialism. You can find some components of postmillennialism, and you also find a movement of the Chialists of arguing that there was going to be some kind of 1,000-year reign of Christ on this earth. And sometimes the same author says two different things. Um, Let me throw out two books, okay? If you can ever get this book at a used bookstore, it's well worth it. I think it's in some Logos packages. It's called Our Legacy by John Hanna. Okay, Our Legacy, the History of Christian Doctrine. I loved that book, and I accidentally gave it away. So I don't have I don't have it anymore, but I've got the PDF copy. And that was not written for scholars. It was written for informed Bible students and pastors. And what he does, he lists one reading after another from the church fathers. It is really a good book. Now, if you want to read his other book called Christian History, An Invitation to Christian History, that's a 2-volume set, and that's like $85. So if you want to throw $85 at a great set, that's far better than Allison's. Now, Allison's is a good introductory. Then you can get Hannah's Invitation to Church History. But Our Legacy is good. And then I don't recall the name of it, but Norm Geisler, back in probably the 70s, I would think, he wrote a little primer. It's just a real little one, maybe 150 pages, on the church fathers in the millennial kingdom.
Hmm.
And and he just, I mean, he just cites one scholar after another and quotes them simply to show that there were a good number of church fathers who believed in a future 1,000-year reign of Christ. So that'd be by Geisler. So at any rate, if you ever have a
question.
chance, oh, you got it, Jacob, you got it.
So who's the author of that again?
Show it, Jacob. Show it up there.
Oops. Yeah, who's
John
the author?
Hanna. John
Hanna.
Hanna
Okay.
from Dallas Seminary. I think I got this as a freebie. Yeah. Dallas must have been doing like a giveaway or something like 10 years ago or something. So I thought it sounded familiar. So yeah, can't say I've read it, but it's on my shelf.
Yeah, it's easy reading, and it's just fun because basically he makes some assertions and then he just quotes a bunch of church fathers. I used it in the Ph.D. course I used to teach in ecclesiology and eschatology, and I would just have students read it and summarize it, and then I would have them go back and find the actual book, maybe if it was by like Tertullian or well, Polycarp or whoever, and then they'd have to get the whole context. But it's really it's a good book. Okay. So my big criticism of Allison in this section is that he doesn't. I don't think he does enough to show that there was no real eschatological strong system in the early church, except that Christ was going to return and judge the living and the dead. But again, I want to be fair, right? It is an introductory text. So,
I also found it weird. I also found it weird that he didn't ever use the term Kiliism to refer to the early church.
Yeah,
like,
I thought that was weird too.
He quoted Calvin, a translation, of course, of Calvin, as using the term. But I was like, boy, isn't that common nomenclature? Like when you see the word Kiliism, you know you mean primitive premillennialism. That isn't the same thing as historic or dispensational. So just minor addendum there on that.
Yeah, and guys, I know, like the PhD program here at Calvary is a general based doctorate, which I'm a fan of. But I tell you what, and I got rid of a lot of my stuff when I moved, but I had it between 10 and 15 good volumes of church history, and it's well worth to get a couple. Church history and church doctrine. And I had one, from Reformed, from Catholic, Lutheran, and I just loved reading and interacting with that stuff. So, for what it's worth, I think it's worthwhile. But good work. You guys, I was really pleased with I think your assessments here are probably the best I've got um, from the assessments on Allison's books. I thought you guys were good, fair. So, okay. Here's what I'd like to do, fellas. I'd like to look at this idea of the Baptist movement. Okay. And there's a little method in what I wanted to accomplish here. So, before we do, just kind of spout out what are some key key New Testament truths or passages about the church.
Ephesians 3.
Okay, absolutely. Ephesians 3. We have that. We have the mystery. Okay. What did Jesus say about the church?
He would build it, and the gates of hell would not prevail against it. Okay.
I will, future tense, build my church. And the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And the imagery there is that it is Jesus's church. He owns it because he purchased it with his blood, according to Acts 20. And the church is viewed as something that is on the move. It will be growing. And it will be invading the domain of Satan, which is the world, of course. The imagery of the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. The imagery of a gated city. What would be generally the weakest point of a walled city? Well, it would be the gates, right? Because they're on the hinge, and that's where enemies would attack. So they would fortify the gates with guard towers, hot tar, so they would guard those gates. So that the gates then became the most important, deepest defended part of the city. And Jesus said, the gates of Hades, the very strength of the evil one, would not prevail. The church is to be fluid, not static, and not even flexible, because flexible means you bend and then you go back. It's to be fluid. It can take many forms. In the New Testament, there's not a whole lot written about the form of the church, is there? We're told there's 2 ordinances, maybe 3 if you're Plymouth Brethren, maybe, but we'll say 2 ordinances, the Lord's Supper, and we're given some instruction about that in baptism. The church is a geopolitical people of God. It's not restricted to a political environment. It is to be on the move. All that to say that there's nothing in the New Testament that suggests a static, single model of church. in the book of Acts, we see organization added to the church that is designed to protect and promote body life. Okay, so if you read Acts critically, every time there's a crisis, the apostles step in, or the Lord will himself will step in and add something, a protection or a doctrine or truth to the church to protect it, promote body life. In the 80s, that was a big movement, guys, the body life movement. Gene Getz did a lot of that stuff. It was really healthy. There's nothing, I guess what I'm rambling on about is there's nothing in the New Testament to suggest this highly advanced form of the church that can never change. And one of the really unfortunate elements of conservative Baptist thinking, and by conservative, I don't mean conservative Baptist, I mean the of ultra fundamental Baptist thought or Landmarkian thinking, is that the way they do church is the way that church was done in the book of Acts. And that the way they do church is the way that you have to do church. And the way that they do church is the way you have to do church if you go to Mexico. Okay. That you have to have a lot of those components, and you have to also have all those church officers. So if you have if you're a hardcore Landmarkian, I mean, if you got a church treasurer, they try to justify that from the book of Acts, that somebody kept records after Pentecost. Somebody was keeping records, and they try to argue that everything they do in their church is a direct result of prescriptive scripture. Now, there are more responsible contemporary Landmarkian ideas, but that is really limiting. And I think because of that, a lot of Landmarkian churches just closed because they were ineffective, right? Their models, their structures were so rigid. How many of you guys had ever heard of a Landmarkian church before this? Okay. How many of you guys have ever interacted much with Landmarkian church people?
I realized after reading the material that I was not familiar with the term, but the concepts, yeah, have bumped into those, periodically along the way.
I had a student last year when I taught this module. He said they're all around. They're all around to me. He goes, I fight with them all the time. And like anything, guys, you do have more moderate, more responsible, contemporary people who promote kind of a Landmarkian approach. They try to make that argument, and they're more responsible. So I pasted some stuff in about Baptist secessionism, and there is nothing in the New Testament to suggest that there is this one single pure model of church that goes from one person, one generation to the next. Rather, the apostles assert that we have access to their writings, okay? Ephesians chapter 3, right? We have access to their writings. Ephesians 2, the church is being built into a temple. And it's built on the foundation of the truth that the apostles, prophets gave to us. And that's fully knowable and understandable. So the New Testament model is not that somehow there's this continuous line of pure, unadulterated of a model of church from Christ or from John the Baptist on up, but rather we have access to the apostolic revelation. And as long as we're following what they say about the church, we can have a biblical church. So I think the whole idea of Baptist secessionism is just really weird, to be honest with you, because on the one hand, the people who argue that also argue for the absolute, complete, full authority of Scripture. And they attack the Roman Catholic Church for having some kind of a secessionist viewpoint. So I've always thought this would be really strange. I even as a new Christian, and I heard some pastors occasionally come in and preach that Jesus started the First Baptist Church. You guys ever hear that? Jacob, have you? I mean,
Usually it's Acts. It's Acts I've heard more frequently that the church in Jerusalem was the First Baptist Church of
yeah,
Jerusalem. Basically, is more common than Jesus. Probably just more dispensationally focused on that.
Yeah, I heard that once. I was a fairly new Christian, and I whispered to, I was just a young single college guy. I whispered to one of the person next to me. I said, "What? What?" So I wonder if Peter started the Second Baptist Church or something, you know. um, so I've listed some things in the reply section on different views of secessionism. For instance, some people argue that the First Baptist Church that Jesus started or that John the Baptist started ordained Baptist pastors, and then they went out and started Baptist churches, and then they ordained Baptist. So sometimes they argue for secessionism through ordination, or secessionism through one church started another church. But ultimately, the idea is that if you look back in history, okay, you can see the stepping stones to the very first church, and that church sets kind of a prototype for us. And it's just weird. I just have to say, it's just weird. Now, that's secessionism, okay? The Landmarkianism started in I don't know, like the middle 1800s. And there was a lot of purist groups back then. That's when the Church of Christ started. You had the Mormon Church. There were a lot of these so-called purist movements, and they their biggest theological error is that they denied or greatly diminished the universal church. They argued that there was no expression of Christ's church except the local church. So they put the local church on double steroids. Some of them outright denied the universal church. Others said no, the universal church would just be in heaven. So everything was local church. And they argued for closed communion. They argued for really closed baptism, so that if you were immersed after you became a believer in a Baptist church, and then you moved and you went to another Landmarkian Baptist church, you might have to be rebaptized. And they were certainly against any kind of parachurch organization. They tended to be very cliquish, very separatistic, because if if your local church is the sum total manifestation of Christ the body in your in your existence, then that's where you're going to do all your fellowship. Whereas today, we don't have landmarking emphasis. We have the opposite problem. We have the opposite problem where the universal church is on steroids. And the kingdom age, kingdom people, kingdom singing, and we use these very generic phrases. And if anything, it's flipped, where the local church it's stripped of its ministry and authority. One group that was Landmarkian, they didn't call themselves that, but they were. would be BBF, Baptist Bible Fellowship. Have you guys ever interacted with BBF people? Jacob? No? Okay, well,
No,
I
heard the name.
okay. Yeah, I came to know the Christ. That's the church I got saved in. It was huge. Now BBF thought Bob Jones was kind of liberal, so and this was this was back in the early 80s. So King James or KJV only, separatistic. But boy, they shared the gospel with me. I got saved. They loved me. I was only there a couple months, I'm glad. Um, that doesn't mean everybody in the church was that way, but that was the kind of, it was not a real healthy culture, I don't think, for people to grow in. Of course, back in those days, I was a young 20-year-old and I had come to faith, and they were very kind and good to me and nurtured me. Uh, the Baptist Bible College in Springfield, Missouri, okay, um, had a Landemarkian emphasis. We always we always would distinguish between the BBC of Clark Summit and the BBC of Missouri, because the BBC of Missouri, the older guys there that taught at that school, they denied the existence of the universal church, right? Because they're Landemarkian. So that's a huge theological error. The other guys, the other issue with the Landemarkian movement is they didn't stratify how they held doctrine. You know, we have first order doctrinal truth that if you mess up, you become an apostate, right? The deity of Christ, the humanity of Christ, the resurrection of Christ, the return of Christ. Those are key doctrinal parts of the faith. Um, whether you drink wine or not is not to be equated with the deity of Christ, right? I'm not saying it's not important, but those are two separate things. And the Landmarkians, they held everything the same weight. Now they weren't the only ones that did that, but they didn't stratify their doctrinal substructure. And believe me, if you didn't fit in, you didn't fit in. You know, it was like us four and no more, out the door. So that's a little bit about the Landmarkian movement. Occasionally, you'll run into some people out here in Tennessee. I don't know if people are Landmarkian or not, but I got to tell you, this has been like a cross-cultural experience. There are a lot of churches out here, they're King James Version only. I mean, you see people driving their cars and trucks with stickers, magnetic stickers on their, KJV only. There there are people out here, Tennessee, this part of Kentucky, that if you talk about coming to Christ, sometimes they'll ask you, well, what Bible translation did someone use to lead you to Christ? Well, I don't know. New American Standard. Well, are you sure you're a Christian? Because if they didn't use the King James, how could you have gotten saved? I mean, this is like cultic Weirdsville stuff. I'm not saying that's Landmarkian, but Landmarking was King James Version only. Okay. It wasn't KJV priority. It wasn't that the KJV was a good translation. It was the only translation. Um, and we see a lot of that out here in this part of Tennessee. So those are some comments, guys, on Landmarkian. I'm just kind of reading through your stuff here. And you guys are, I mean, you guys hit it all. I mean, you kind of hit the tail, you hit this. Um, your comments on Landmarkianism. I'd like to hear any other comments on it.
Well, I think the character of those individuals is very widespread, even if the movement itself isn't. I mean, I've got guys that I have about 15 people on my block list on Facebook that would ask the same question, not about the King James Bible. They would say, "Were you led to Christ with John 3:16?" And if somebody literally did not use John 3:16 in their gospel presentation, that they chose, then that invalidated their justification, or brought it into question. If they didn't use not only, a particular translation of that particular verse. I mean, that's a similar ilk. We're into Presbyterians, Allison mentioned a regulative principle in that section.
Yeah, yeah.
That's the same idea, really, that they have to assign everything to a scripture verse. And technically, I think I made this. Well, we haven't gotten there yet. Long story, but I already wrote my review of that section. The Roman Catholic Church is the biggest users of the regulative principle out there. They got a 1-for-1 correlation to the entire Old Testament tabernacle worship, or at least attempting to, in their mass and in their architecture. But the sentiment is not unique. I've just run into Bible church people. They'll fight you to the death over a plurality of elders. And when you argue that you don't have a plurality of qualified men, that the plurality is secondary, the qualifications are primary.
Right.
And when I run across a constitution that says we shall have 7 elders, I'm like, you guys have been lucky a long time if you've been under 200 people and you got 7 actual qualified elders. But that sentiment is, I think, a carnality issue, not a particular denomination or whatever you would call them. Sounds like a subsect of a denomination.
Yeah. I think probably the one of the huge shortfalls of the Landmarkian movement was that it had a false sense of unity and a false sense of spirituality. The false sense of unity comes in the fact that your local church is connected to the first local church that Jesus started. That provides a sense of unity. And then this weird idea of a false sense of spirituality. We're spiritual because we are in the more pure branch of Christianity than you are. So you're okay. You're going to a non-Landmarkian Baptist church. Okay. I'll pick on Josh. Okay. I'll say, okay, well, Josh, you're going to a non-Landmarkian church. Matter of fact, you're in a Bible church, right, Josh? Okay, so you're not even a Baptist church. You're pastoring a Bible church. Now we know you're
Don't
a
even like too
Christian.
many Baptists. Yeah.
Okay, we know you're a Christian, but you're not even a Baptist kind of a Christian. And then maybe Jacob's in a Baptist church, if I'm Landmarkian. So, well, you're at least you're in a Baptist church, but you're not in one of the Landmarkian. You're not in one of the Baptist churches that Jesus started, right? That you've got this false sense of unity and a false sense of spirituality. So one of the huge theological errors that some of the more developed Landmarkian churches made as the into the 1900s was how is Christ going to reward me for being in a more pure form of the Baptist church and Christianity than Josh or Jacob? And you know what they concluded? They concluded that they were the true Baptist bride of Christ. They were the bride of Christ. And they were going to be at the marriage supper of the Lamb. It doesn't mean that Jacob's not a Christian. It doesn't mean that Josh is not a Christian for not pastoring a Baptist church, but I got some questions about Josh, right? That's what they would be thinking. But they talked about, like we talked about the bride of Christ, they talked about the Baptist, the bride of Christ. And guys, can you see how that led to a false sense of spirituality? Now, I'm gonna make a conjecture, not positive on this. David Gunn would know. As the Baptist Bible Fellowship group, which used to be one of the most fastest growing Baptist movements in the 50s through 70s. It was huge. As that began to diminish, I think some people spun off the idea of the millennial exclusionists. Other words, they're thinking, okay, all right, we may have been wrong about the universal church. And yeah, we were kind of wrong maybe about the King James Version only, maybe. And we were kind of wrong about some of those things. And maybe we can't trace our roots all the way back, maybe. But one thing's for sure is we are more faithful to the Lord. And everybody's the bride of Christ, all Christians, but only the most faithful will get to enjoy the kingdom age. And I wondered if some of that energy in the 50s through 70s of the Landmarkian movement or the BBF Landmarkian ideas, if that didn't create some of the stuff of the millennial exclusionist. I don't know. That's a conjecture on my part. But can you imagine being taught you're the Baptist bride of Christ because your church is more pure? Well, why is it more pure? Well, it's because it's connected to the first Baptist church that Jesus started or that John the Baptist started, and you haven't deviated. You haven't compromised. I mean, Josh compromised. He left the Baptist faith. He pastored a Bible church. And Jacob compromised a little bit because he went to a non-Landmarkian church and uses the New American Standard Bible. We haven't done that. We're using the authorized version. And we're separatist. And you can just see, guys, that false sense of spirituality and a false sense of reward. And when you are in your own little ecclesiastical bubble and the culture around you kind of fits in, you might think that's all fine and good, but that stuff doesn't help curtail the flesh, right? It doesn't help curtail the wicked one. It just props up a false sense of unity and spirituality. I mean, pretty critical about the Landmarkian movement. I mean, there were some good things too. And you can find some more contemporary Landmarkian churches that aren't weird. Okay, they're not weird. I think a lot of the weird ones have died. Any comments here, guys?
I just will. You first.
This is short. With a slight change in vocabulary, they could be raging papists. A very slight change in I mean, like, this is the church that Jesus started. This is, I mean, my Catholic grandma would be able to change about 3 words in the definitions you've just given, and be perfectly comfortable.
Yeah, and to be fair, guys, too, I mean, I've had many students through the years, and I've known some really churches that God has really used to reach a lot of people for Christ that were King James Version only, and it had some of these ideas. And they're just a product of what they were taught, but yet they were still, evangelizing and trying to honor the Lord within the constructs that they were taught. So I'm not being critical of every single church. It's just that the ideas behind them were in error. Go ahead, Jacob.
I haven't thought a lot about Landmarkianism recently, but it's because the King James only point is far more likely here. Like I'm amazed here in upstate New York, it seems that you are more likely to see Baptist churches that are of this King James only variety. You're less likely to find GRBC style, Baptists around here. But I understand how for many of these folks, it's a lack of, and this sounds so elitist, so I don't mean it wrongly, but there's a lack of intellectual maturity. They need to work through how real issues about like how the Bible's been preserved, or how God, the biblical text did not promise that there would be this really nice, clean path through church history of the truth. That it's just they're failing to see how they're making assumptions in their own minds, and their leaders have done that, to assume that God had to have worked in a certain way. And so it's, and like, one final statement just from the progress of doctrine, because of what I just read in the last 2 days from Allison, not on eschatology, but in the next section, is that the congregational model of Baptist church government, that's really recent. Like, you can't find any real, not easily, evidence of that kind of church government. It just turns so fast to the Catholic model. And so there's, I can understand, it's just there needs to be better intellectual maturity. But on the flip side, with an individual person, we're arguing here about church history. How much is that really going to impact church ministry? Like, if they are, I could see some hope for working with a Landmarkian, if he came to my church that I was pastoring. The King James only, that's a little harder, because if you're not using the King James,
Right.
game over, and we've had people in our
It's
church
true.
that
It's true.
that have left because of that were otherwise decent, people, but we just, and we're King James preferred, but it was just the smallest little statement. So King James only is a bit hotter topic, but you see the connection and between it. So
yeah. The other big issue with the movement itself, and even with ultra fundamentalist Christians, not fundamentalism anymore, but the ultra fundamentalist, is very suspicious of higher education. Even in '86, when my wife and I went off to seminary, we were in a great church. We were in a phenomenal church. But even then, there were some people who said, "Now, Dave, you realize you're going off to theological cemetery. You better be careful you don't die and dry up." And I said, "Gosh, I hope I won't. Please pray for me." Um, so there was so higher education was suspected, and that came right out of the second, third generation fundamentalist liberal controversies. The initial fundamentalist, um, they could go toe to toe with the liberals back in the early 1900s. They could. They were trained in Hebrew, Greek, logic, philosophy. Could go toe to toe. But then when they separated and the liberal churches threw them out, and in some cases they left, they started up their own schools and Bible institutes. Well, 2, 3 generations down, those pastors could not go toe to toe with a liberal guy at Princeton or Harvard. They just couldn't. So it was ad hominem attacks, and higher education was under suspect, and that kind of dominated your BBF groups and your Landmarkian groups. But all that changed really in the latter 70s, I think, mid to late 70s. Historic fundamentalism. They had some great scholars that came in. Western Conservative Baptist Seminary was part of that, with Rodmacher, Bob Jones. Okay, they had some great people there. Um, other schools, but there still are really some weird schools out there that teach things. Let me close with this. I was teaching at Cedarville University, when I taught ecclesiology, and back in those days, this would have been like, oh, let me think now, maybe, I don't know, 203, maybe 202, 203, 204, something like that. And came to this, we're talking about freedom in Christ. And all of a sudden, man, my Cedarville students, and it was a good school back. That's before Cedarville drifted. And they said, it's too legalistic here. There's not enough freedom in Christ. And college students, they're just going on and on and on. And finally, this one guy, he raises his hand. He says, Dr. Mappus, I can't believe I'm hearing this. He said, this is my first class here. I transferred here from Pensacola. I can't believe the freedom of Christ here. I can't. And he started sharing things about Pensacola. And I said, now, are you sure about this? And the next class, he brought a bunch of stuff in, papers. And I was like, wow. And again, that was back in 203 or so. Almost cultic. Almost cultic. So, okay, guys, I want to run through with you the origin, at least what I think of, well, actually, I don't. I may put this on the web for you, or we'll do it at a later point. But let me just run over it real quick with you, okay? Because I want to spend some time on that case study. Okay, 3 key people. Okay, here's how I think about the origin of the Baptist movement. Notice not the church, but the movement. 3 key people, 3 key events, and 3 key groups. I'm gonna put this out for your notes. Okay, 3 key people. Okay, 3 key events and 3 key groups. Okay, 3 key people. Who do you think they are in church history?
John the Baptist.
No. F for you. King Henry. Okay. King Henry. Right? He's Catholic. 1509. He reigned from 1509 to 1547. And he leaves the Catholic Church. To do that, it's called the Act of Supremacy. So he becomes the supreme leader in the Catholic Church in England. And he did that for a couple of reasons, but probably the primary reason is, one, he wanted a divorce. But beyond that, there were a lot of tithes and offerings from Mother England that were going into the Catholic Church. And that money was going back over to Spain. And Spain and France were friends, and they were mutual enemies of England. So, King Henry's going, why are we funding our enemies to build ships and stuff to attack us? So and it's even in the Act of Supremacy. So he became supreme. The next person would be his son, Edward, the King Edward, who was 9. He dies 6 years later. He's probably killed. He's probably murdered. And because he was only 9, he had advisors. His advisors were Protestant, Cromwell and others. So they get what's called the 42 Articles, a doctrinal statement. So they begin to make the Catholic Church in England Protestant. And they developed the Act of Uniformity, which means every church has to conform to this doctrinal position, but it wasn't enforced. Okay, so far now we got 2 people, right? We got Henry, and we've got Edward, and Edward dies. Who becomes leader after Edward? Some people think his sister poisoned him. Bloody
Mary.
Mary. Okay, Mary Tudor becomes queen. Daughter of Henry VIII, she marries Philip of Spain. She's a staunch Catholic. Horrible persecution. So groups flee. A lot of people were martyred. It was horrible, guys, horrible. And let me just jump ahead here. And then we have Elizabeth. Queen Elizabeth reigns a long time. So Queen Elizabeth says, you know what? We're not going to have this. First you're Catholic, then you're Protestant, then you're Catholic. We're not going to be torn apart. What's happening in France is not going to happen here. So she said, we're going to be Protestant. And we're going to have 39 articles. And that's when they dissolved the monasteries. They burned all that stuff, and they enforced the Act of Uniformity. Well, the problem is by then you had a lot of congregations that had grown apart from the Catholic structure. They were just little Protestant churches. And now you have Elizabeth saying, okay, we're going to be a Protestant nation. That's it, period. And everybody's going to agree. Well, that was a real problem for some, because some of the things in the doctrinal statement say you have to be approved by the church to preach the gospel. You have to be licensed. And if not, it's a crime. Matter of fact, there's a famous Baptist who spent a lot of time in his prison because he preached without a license. You guys know who it is? Bunyan, right? John Bunyan, right? Wrote Pilgrim's Progress. So what happens is you've got three groups, okay? Three groups that respond to this act of uniformity. There are three reform groups. Okay? One group says the national church, okay, fine. You want to have a national church? Fine. But it needs to be governed through elders appointed by local churches. So we're going to have elders from local churches go, they're going to form a synod, and then they're going to work with the parliament and a crown to initiate change. It's called the Presbyterian model. Okay. The next group, they were non-separating Congregationalists. They said, look, each individual church will try to initiate form through parliament and the crown to change a national church. They were autonomous. They were regenerate churches, but they were pedo-Baptists. They baptized babies. And they emphasized unity. They said, you know, we're part of Mother England. We don't want to be separated from Mother England, but we don't want to be part of the national church, but we're just going to work with the crown and parliament to initiate change in the national church view. Eventually, they would go to Massachusetts Bay. And then there was the separating Congregationalist. Okay, so which group do you think the Baptists came from, guys? Did they come from the Presbyterian model? No. Did they come from the non-separating? No. They came from the separating Congregationalist. Eventually, this group would flee England and establish the Plymouth Bay Colony. They were autonomous, regenerate, but they practiced pedobaptism. Well, before they came to the Americas, they fled. Okay? And they went over to, I think it was Denmark, I think, Switzerland, somewhere out there. I can't recall. Okay? Thomas Holloway and Smith. And they got mixed up. They went to Amsterdam. Okay? They took a group of 80 and they fled England in 1609 and they went to Amsterdam. And they got linked into some Anabaptists. Now, Anna, right, means re. So they got mixed up with people who were rebaptizing themselves after conversion. That's what the Anabaptists did. And the Anabaptists were persecuted horribly. The Lutherans hated them. The Catholics hated them because they would rebaptize themselves. So they got mixed up with them. with some Mennonite church, and they realized, you know what? The Bible teaches you're supposed to be saved first and then baptized. So they rebaptized themselves. Okay. So now you got all the pieces of the Baptist movement. Okay. Autonomous churches, you've got regenerate churches, and gospel, and they rebaptized themselves. And then they went back to England in 1612, and they established what later became known as the First General Baptist Church. General simply meant their view of atonement. Okay, so they did not have the particular view. They did not have a limited view of atonement. Their view was unlimited. That was called general. And there was debate whether they even initially used the term Baptist. They historically they much preferred the phrase "we are people of the way," or "we are the rebaptized." Okay, so they used those phrases much more than Baptist. But eventually they were called Baptist, and I think it was a term of derision. And you Baptist. Yes, today people say I'm a Baptist. I'm proud of it. Well, back then I was like, you Baptist. And that was it's kind of a crash course on where I think the Baptist movement started. Okay, now there were always regenerate churches, and there were autonomous churches, and I'm sure there were other churches that practiced immersion, but at some point all those pieces came together to coalesce into an actual movement. And so I tend to think the Baptist movement started out of the English descent uh, that was occurring, and eventually they came to the U.S. and the movement grew very, very quickly. Um, and I would just say that the early Baptists were nothing like the Baptists of today. Historically, they were godly, pious people, and they viewed their walk with God sincerely, and they viewed every person having a ministry in the church, the priesthood of the believer, all the things that would generally make up the Baptist distinctives. They held at a very deep level. The idea of covenanting together as a local assembly to help one another grow in Christ and stuff. That was part of their DNA. It was never just reduced to simple membership. It was always we are in covenant. We're a covenant family, and they really did practice those things well. And the Baptist movement grew, it flourished, especially in America, but also in England. Some people, there's only one Baptist group that traces their history directly out of the Anabaptist movement, and that's the Swedish Baptist. It's possible. It's very possible that they came out of that. And the Swedish Baptists came here and they started up what's called the General Baptist Conference, which a lot of Swedes went to Minnesota, and that's where the General Baptist Conference movement started there. Now they call it Converge, and that they've gone astray. They've drifted quite a bit. But my wife's family is from that conference, that Baptist conference, and Bethel Seminary was their school. John Piper used to teach at Bethel, and then he left. And when he was pastoring, he started up his own seminary because Bethel was just drifting so much. So it's possible that the Swedish Baptist did come out of the Anabaptist movement directly, but probably most Baptist scholars think that the movement started as I've described. The other thing with this, let's see. No, I think I've said enough about all that. Any comments, guys, on that, or just questions?
I'm sorry, what were the three events? I think I got distracted. What were the free events at the beginning that you were saying, like free people, free events, free groups?
Yeah, the events would be the let me pull it back up here because I'm jumping around here. The act of supremacy,
Oh, yes. Yep.
the act of uniformity,
Mm-hmm.
and then can't remember the third one. I think the enforcement of the act of uniformity, I think. No, the act of supremacy, the 42 articles, and then the act of uniformity.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And guys, if you've never read that, you ought to. Matter of fact, I've got a bunch of notes. I'll try to pull it out and put it in the web page for us. When you read what some of those doctrinal provisions are, they're great, but others are, you could just see how this would lead to staunch persecution. I mean, and even in our own nation, and we're all kind of, in the westernized Christianity here in the US. Just imagine a government eventually saying, you know what, you're not allowed to preach. You're leading people astray, you're spreading false rumors, so you can't preach unless you get the stamp of our federal government. You can't preach in a church. You can't be a church. I can see something like that kind of happening. We'll take away your tax deduction. Fine, take it away. Take it. We'll strip you of all your retirement benefits. Okay. We'll take your property because you're disruptive to our community. I can see things like that happening. Things far worse than that were happening in England. And the Anabaptists, those who rebaptized themselves, the most popular way to torture and kill them was to take them out on a boat, tie them to a rock, and they would say, oh, you want to be baptized? We'll baptize you. And throw them overboard and they were drowned. And it was from the Catholics, from the Lutherans, because they didn't understand. One of the worst days of my life was when my father came at me with his fists clenched, yelling and screaming, "You blankety blank 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 Baptist," And I remember thinking, Lord, I can't hit my dad. I mean, I can't hit my dad, but I'm not going to let him beat on me either. And I just turned around the last minute and left. And I couldn't go back. I was not allowed. I was not allowed to. I was just 20, brand new baby Christian, maybe 2 months old in the Lord, because I'd been baptized and rebaptized. And as horrible as it was, the joy that I was experiencing with Christ overshadowed that. And by God's grace, that my dad and I, a year later, it was good. And my dad accepted Christ before he died. I've seen a lot of my family members come to Christ. But just think if you were living in that era where if you wanted to follow the Lord in baptism, it might actually lead to your death. My mom begged me not to be baptized, and I had a great mom. She just wait, honey, just wait till you're out of college and you're on your own. Just wait. And I said, well, Mom, I'm not sure you're supposed to wait. I'll have to think about that. And ultimately, once somebody said, well, why did you get baptized? I mean, why was that so important to you? And, as a brand new Christian, I just said, well, Jesus was baptized and I wanted to be like Jesus. So I got baptized. Okay. I don't want to just prattle on. Let me, guys, let me go to the web page here. I want to point out just a key thing. Okay. You guys did great on this name change assignment. Um, but I want to just point out one thing, and I'll let you go. So let me do a quick share screen. Okay, you guys seeing this screen? Share screen? Okay, all right. Respond right here. This is where I'm at right here. Respond to the case study. Okay. Some churches remove the name Baptist or a Bible since they believe the terms Baptist or Bible carry a negative perception, and they don't want to change their doctrine, but they want to change the name. Okay. Now, as a pastor, you got two groups. And you have to identify with each group. You have to try to understand and what they're coming from and help. You're trying to prevent a church split. Churches have split over these issues. Matter of fact, I've done this case study and I've had students that told me, our church split over this issue. I have a key question for each group. When I interact with a group that wants to change the name, we'll call them the name changing group. What do I want to know from that group? What do you think? What do you guys really want to know from that group? The name changing group. What is it that you need to discern from that group?
I would say, what do you hope to gain? I mean, what's the need that you perceive behind the change in the name? That's what you're asking
Yeah,
there?
and what they're going to say is that, well, they think that if you change the name, it'll open up doors for evangelism and people will come in and get saved.
And I would say that's a good reason. Doesn't necessarily mean we're going to change the name, but I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, yeah. That's their rationale. Okay. Now, how true it is another question. Um, Though, to be honest with you, we had our neighbor in Phoenix, and my wife invited her to church, and she said, "Oh no, I grew up in a Baptist church, and I don't want to go to a Baptist church." And she said, "Well, my husband's a pastor of a Bible church." She goes, "Oh, really? Well, I'll go." She came and got accepted the Lord. So there's a case in point where it was that was an issue. But there's something else, though, I want to know from this group. I know what they're saying, and I can understand it, but there's something else I want to know from this group. What is it? Or what do you need to know from this group as a pastor?
We need to know how's their personal walk with God.
Well, here's what you need to know, and here's a question. Now, this is a question I have for this group when I meet with them privately. You want to change the name? Want to drop the name Baptist? Want to drop the name Bible? You want to call it Grace Point? Why do you want to drop the name church? You want to drop Baptist or Bible. That's what you're saying. That's what you're saying. Those two terms create a cultural barrier and bring up misperceptions. Okay, that's what you said. But you want to call us Grace Point. why do you want to drop the name church? I want to press them on that in a loving, probative way. Oh, well, because, people have had bad experiences at church, and, we thought that would be good too. Okay. So really there's 3 words you want to drop, really, right? Or 2, right? A Baptist church or Bible church. You want to be Grace Point. Okay. You don't have to have the name church to be a church, right? You don't have to do that. But I need to find out what else they are thinking that they might want to drop. What else? What authors they have been reading, who has influenced them to think that by dropping a name and going through the expense of changing a name, it's going to open up all these evangelistic opportunities. Okay, I want to find out before I go down that road. I want to find out. In this particular instance, the church decided to change their name to Grace Point. And as soon as they did, they found out that this same group also felt that having a 45-minute preaching sermon would also alienate people. So they wanted a little 15 or 20-minute devotion. And they also felt that it would be far better to bring in some professional singing, professional athletic Christians and Christians of notoriety to do some of this. And they also really felt that it would be inappropriate on a Sunday morning to talk about sensitive issues like the debate on the roles of men and women. That's better discussed in a home Bible study. And they also felt it would be good to never have kids in the church because they're disruptive. And parents have been with their kids all week, so let's just have a really robust junior church. So, in other words, this group had far more in mind than just the name change. And see, that the tip of it was, you say you want to drop, in this case, it was Baptist, but you really want to drop the term church. Now, by the way, I'm not opposed to changing a name, but I am opposed to going down a road if I don't know where it goes. All right, so I want to pursue that. And there's something else I need to share with the whole church, right? The whole church. I'm going to share. Look, this is going to be a long process. So we need to pray for one another. We need to stay on the same page with one another. And if we do decide to change the name of First Community Baptist Church to First Community or to Grace Point, we're looking at least a 2-3 year process. So in the meantime, let's do what we're supposed to be doing, which is evangelizing and discipling. Let's just do it while we consider the name change. But you see, maybe some people in this name change group, maybe they want to put all their energy into changing the name, changing the church, so the church can be more effective without even doing evangelism while they're changing the name. What does that sound like? That sounds like a church growth marketing ploy to me. Now, I'm not against changing the name. Guys, I've pastored Baptist churches, Bible churches, community churches. I'm not opposed to changing the name. But I don't want to go down that road unless I know where it's going. Okay. The other group, I want to hear about their families that were persecuted for being rebaptized. I want to find out how can we remember these martyrs of the faith, and I want to talk with them, but I also want to help them understand that we can't just look back. Right? That's not sharing Christ. We are ministering in the culture that God has placed us. And that if you are in an area where a name is only viewed pejoratively, what's the big deal? How does changing a name dishonor your loved ones who died for uh, the doctrine of being rebaptized? How? Doesn't. It really doesn't. Unless, of course, you change your view of baptism. And I want these groups to talk together. I want some cross pollination. I want the name changing group to hear about how the other group had great grandpas and great grandmas, or great great grandpas and great great grandmas who were beaten, who had their property stolen, who were disowned, who were displaced because they were baptized in a Baptist church. I want them to hear that. At the same time, I want the people who don't want to have the name changed, I want them to hear from the other group talking about how some contemporary groups view uh, a Baptist church or a church. I don't want the church to split, and if I'm a pastor, I'm going to be really careful to work at this, and I'm going to stretch it out. I'm going to stretch it out and really see how much life there is in this, in this, in this idea, and I might look into it to say, okay, well, I talked to an attorney to change it. It's going to cost this much. It's going to take this much time. And that's even, that's on top of figuring out what we would want to call ourselves. So let's consider it. Let's pray about it for 6 months. Let's keep praying about it. And we're going to come back in 6 months and we're going to talk about it more. But in the meantime, let's just do it. And if people in our area don't like the term church or Baptist or Bible, let's help them understand what a true Bible church is, and share Christ with your neighbors and friends and people that know you. So that's kind of, I think, how I would want to navigate this. And you guys did good. You had fun with it, but I want to know who's influencing them and what roads they want to go down before I start. Any comments, guys? And isn't it really kind of silly? I mean, isn't it theological naiveness to think that just by changing a name,
Yeah.
it's gonna open up all these incredible evangelistic opportunities just by adding chairs in your building and taking out pews. It's gonna revolutionize your church just by tweaking it here and tweaking it there and making this little change. It's gonna revolutionize the church.
When I came to El Paso Bible Church, we had a much more vehement and probably founded argument for changing our name. There'd been a nuclear apocalypse 3 times over, kind of surprised that any church still existed a year later when I got here. And it doesn't change substance. And if you're not changing your substance, in my opinion, don't change your name, because you're indicating a change of substance. So you have all these horrible events, massive quantities of adultery, fornication, fiduciary malfeasance. I mean, like, just at a scale that shouldn't even be able to happen. But you take Bible and church out of your name at minimum, and what are you saying? Well, we have to fix this some other way. The church doesn't have the capacity to utilize the Bible to resolve this, and we have to disavow those things. I mean, I really think that you have a problem doing that. These people, I think I mentioned in my response, they have a real problem just with basic ecclesiology, basic concept of what worship is, if they really, because they're focusing on both groups are focusing on the worship services evangelistic value specifically. I have nothing wrong with inviting unbelievers to church at all as a strategy to reach them, certainly. But that, I mean, I would hope to have short circuited this way before with the, what does it mean to, what is worship? What do we gather for corporately, and what does the church need before the church is equipped to reach people? What do you need?
Yeah. Yeah.
And why is church offensive? Well, I'll tell you why church is offensive to people. It's because there's this bunch of crap where the church thinks that it exists for corporate worship as evangelism, and they're not taught to be discipled, and they're backbiting, backstabbing, treating each other in extremely carnal ways. So then they go to evangelism, Jesus saves and Jesus changes everything, and all the church growth garbage out there that may have some meaning, but it's just repetitive. And then they get in and find out that it's actually worse than their office environment. And it's because they spent 30 years, whatever, focusing on evangelism, and usually not even with a clear gospel message. So that's a different topic. But I mean, they're focusing on that. So, I would not have separate meetings with these people. I think I mentioned that also. I would force them to look each other in the eyeballs. If you're going to call each other nasty names, or you're going to say they have nasty ideas, you're going to do it with eyeballs on each other, period. And kind of let the chips fall a little bit. But I think that you have a progression, right, in a congregationalist environment. Hopefully the Constitution has something to say about the process for this and how it's going to take place. And it's not simply me saying, let's wait 6 months. I mean, I'm hoping that's not the case. But I think you've got 2/3 of a split already here.
Well, you might.
Yeah. I mean, you don't. Yeah. So,
you might. And oftentimes the argument is made, well, if we were starting a new church, would we use that name? Well, that maybe not. I mean, like if I was going to go out and plant a church today, in this area, there's a lot of things I might do different than what most churches do. But if I'm in a church that's established, a local body of Christ, that if they're at all functional, and if there's some body life, before I break that up, I want to really sense the Lord's leading and presence, and want to make it a big matter of prayer. And I want people to be unified, and I don't mind waiting. I mean, if God is leading and burdening us to do something in September, you know what? There's not full understanding or unity. He's still going to be leading us to do that in December or January. So I'm not afraid to wait to sense the moving of the Lord. And um, I want to know who's influencing the group, and I want to know just where they want to go before we start going that way. And I also want the other group to know that it's good to look back, it's good to remember, it's good to honor, but we have a whole generation of people to reach. Let me close with this, guys. When I taught at Cedarville University for 9 years, I was on staff in a large Baptist church of around 1,000 people. And we were beginning to, get some blowback from people about, well, we want more hymns. Oh, we want more choruses. It wasn't horrible. Oh, we don't like the way these young people are coming to church. They're wearing shorts and flip-flops. Oh, why do we always have to sing the songs the older people want to sing? You know, we weren't, it wasn't horrible, but it was, we felt it needed to be addressed. So our pastor, you know, we did some stuff on unity, and then we did something Sunday night that changed the nature of the church for a while. I can't remember what it was called, but it had a creative name. Basically, it was a panel discussion. Okay, and we had a charter member of the church. We had a couple there, and this guy had had an affair. And anyway, we had like 7 or 8 people on this panel, and they all shared a little bit. And the charter, this old guy, he stands up, he takes his Bible. He goes, I was a member of this church when it started in somebody's living room, and I've seen it grow. He said, most of you know I lost my wife 2 years ago. He said, the hardest thing for me is to come to this church because it reminds me of Ethel. And we helped start this church, and all my friends, you know, and he went on and on. He was weeping, you know, and he said, but I'm so glad. I'm so glad that God took her first so she wouldn't have to go through this pain. And let me tell you something. We had a lot of college kids from Cedarville. They needed to hear that. Right? They needed to hear that. And people shared. And then there's this little 7th grade girl that gets up. And she says, well, my mom and I wrote out something for me to share, but I'm not going to share it. She said, one of the hardest things for me, you can pray for me, is I have to go to school every single day. Guys, 7th grade. I have to go to school every single day. And all the boys and girls make fun of me because I'm still a virgin. You know, our older people needed to hear that. So no longer was kids wearing shorts and flip-flops a big issue. When they realized those kids are being teased because of sexual purity. And no longer is the songs that the old people want to sing as big a deal because they hear this old guy who started the church say he didn't even want to come anymore because the church reminded him of his wife, but yet he felt he needed to be there. And that's the kind of the body life and cross pollination that we have got to foster in churches. And I'll tell you what, that there was a marked difference in our church after that. I'm going to call it panel discussion. I don't know what we called it. That is body life. That is unity. That's oneness. As people shared, you know, about what God was doing in their life and struggles that they were having, and it was a beautiful service. So that's kind of how I wanted to close this. So that's what I want to see, you know, in a church. So, tell you what, guys, I'll cut and paste, and I'll put some of these church notes in this week 2, so you can review them. Okay. Good work. I don't want to prattle on, but great job with Allison. Good job on the case study. Guys are doing super work. So, any closing comments or questions?
Well, I appreciate you saying one thing. I appreciate you saying that, you know, that we did a good job on our assignments, but in reading, you know, Josh's assignments and Jacob's assignments, those guys really did well. And I enjoyed reading their work. I do not feel that I did as well. I don't think I was up to the standards that they presented. So I'm a little sheepish about that. I appreciate you saying we all did real good, but I'm a little concerned that maybe I'm having trouble keeping up with these two stalwart, scholars. So appreciate the way that they can interact with the literature, with the writings contemporary and other, and the way that they were able to think through the ideas. So I'm learning a lot from those guys, but I do, I'm struggling a little bit with whether I'm able to keep up or whether I am keeping up to the level that they are. I'm kind of
Well,
reminded a little bit of Jay and Darby, what you mentioned. I kind of took a little solace from that he read the scriptures and he synthesized. He thought deeply, he read the scripture, and he tried to understand it. And then the other approach is to become saturated in the literature of scholarship and otherwise. And I find that tack a little more challenging for me personally, and I admire the way these two guys are able to navigate that terrain.
well, Don, you're doing fine, and if you're not, I'll let you know. So don't. Everybody has their strengths and weaknesses. Okay, guys, I hope you have a wonderful week. I will put some of those church history notes in the reply probably tomorrow sometime, so you can go back and look at that. This is a fun class. It's a lot of your written assignments are kind of like on eschatology. The forum stuff is on ecclesiology. So your case studies for next week, throw your heart into it. I mean, just throw your heart into it. You'll have your options. So, guys, I'll be praying for you this week, and I hope you have a great week. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
Thanks, Don.
Good night.
Good night, guys.